Good afternoon, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 42 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting to hear from witnesses on the study of federal assistance for various natural resource industries. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Now that we're in session, I'd like to remind all participants screenshots are no longer allowed or taking photos, but proceedings are being televised and made available via the House of Commons website. A few quick comments for the benefit of our witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before starting to speak. For those participating by video conference, you'll have to activate your own microphone, so click on the microphone to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when not speaking. For those on Zoom, there is interpretation available. You have the choice of either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you have the earpiece that you can use for the translation. All comments should be addressed through the chair. And for those on screen, if you want to speak, please use the raise hand function. When we get into the questions and answers section, I do allow the members a fair bit of latitude, whoever is questioning, and so if they don't get to you, it's because they have a line of questioning that they may want to be pursuing. But if you feel you want to weigh in, raise your hand, and if they get to you, they get to you. Let's see. In accordance with the routine motion, the committee is notified that all witnesses appearing virtually have completed the required connection test in advance of the meeting. And so now I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Virtually, we have the BC Council of Forest Industries with Linda Cody, President and CEO. Quebec Forest Industry Council, Jean-François Samray, President and CEO, and I've been notified that Monsieur Samray has to depart by 5:15 today. And so if anyone has any questions for the Quebec Forest Industry Council, try to get those in before 5:15. Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, we have Lisa McDonald, the Executive Director, and Jeff Killeen, Director Policy and Programs. In person, we have three organizations represented, including Forest Products Association of Canada with Derek Nyber, President and CEO. FP Innovations, Stéphane Renou, President and CEO, welcome. And from the National Aboriginal Forestry Association, Bradley Young, Executive Director. With that, we're going to go into 5-minute opening statements for each of you. And if you're ready, Ms. Cody from the BC Council of Forest Industries, I will start the clock when you start speaking. And I'll say, I have a handy card system, so I'll give you the yellow card when there's 30 seconds left in the clock, and the red card means time's up, don't stop mid-sentence, but wind up your thoughts so we can go on to the next person. And by way of other introductions, welcome to Ms. Gladue for joining us today, and welcome back to Mr. Maloney, who's filling in while Ms. Jones is away. So, James, good to see you. And so with that, Ms. Cody, over to you for your opening 5-minute statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. As President and CEO of the BC Council of Forest Industries, I have the pleasure of representing forest products producers in BC. Our membership includes companies big and small that make everything from lumber to pulp and paper, and from high-valued engineered wood products to biofuels. We appreciate the committee's interest in our sector. Forestry is an industry that will continue to play a major role in supporting good jobs and helping to fight climate change. And these are both, as you know, dual imperatives at this critical time in history. For those of you who may not be familiar, I want to say a few words about the role the forest sector plays in BC as well as the rest of Canada's resource economy. While it obviously isn't as big an economic player as the energy sector, it has a presence at a landscape level that arguably elevates and extends its influence in rural communities across Canada and urban centres alike. In BC's case, the forest industry contributes $13 billion to BC's GDP, and even more in taxes and fees, 100,000 direct and indirect jobs, and the sector has outsized impact on wages and government revenues in BC, as well as on exports and trade balances that help support the standard of living in both BC and the rest of Canada. Today, forest products make up 1/3 of BC's exports, with an exciting opportunity to grow our sector as customers around the world turn to low-carbon, renewable sustainable forest products as the building and packaging materials of choice. Being part of a country with a small open economy means that strong trade relations and diversified markets are critical to our industry success, and so is our ability to demonstrate global leadership and innovation on sustainable forest practices and low carbon forest products. Which brings me to the topic of your study, which federal assistance measures for Canada's forest industry can make a difference. I have 5 points. First, Canada needs to stand firm on the role that sustainable forest management and forest products, from lumber and food packaging to biofuels, can play as tools to fight climate change and pollution while supporting local livelihoods. It is critical that Canadians and customers around the world know the facts about our regulatory regimes and systems for forest product certifications and assurance. It's also critical that we show the world we're doing the work to continuously evolve and strengthen our forest management regimes to keep forests and biodiversity health safe and deal with the impacts of climate change and the disruption caused by forest fires, pests, and more. Second, we must backstop Canada's reputation for sustainable natural resources with policy, regulation, and incentives that improve predictability and investment on the land base and enable product innovation and adoption. Among other things, this means taking a more integrated approach to everything we do. This includes maximizing climate-smart forestry and managing forests for all the different values they represent, including timber, carbon, and other natural infrastructure. This will require doubling down on important national initiatives aimed at addressing critical gaps in workforce and skills development, as well as delivering on other federal strategic priorities, such as the Buy Clean strategy, the National Net Zero Building Strategy, and the Low Carbon Building Materials Innovation Hub. And it will require effective engagement at both the global and local level on the development of emerging frameworks for regulation and trading of carbon and biodiversity. Thirdly, as we look to the future, our industry has an incredible opportunity to help meet growing global demand for climate-friendly products. This even includes our biggest trading partner to the south of the border. It's why a Team Canada approach to the softwood lumber dispute is critical. For decades, and regardless of who is in government, Canadians have benefited from a unified voice on this issue that has extended across party lines and across different regions of the country. We appreciate that. Like her predecessors, Minister Ng and the team at Global Affairs are continuing this approach while driving discussions with the U.S. Fourth, as we look to the future, we need to continue our efforts on both market and product diversification. Over the last 2 decades, in partnership with the provincial and federal governments, our industry has developed new overseas markets, particularly in Asia. Our partnership with NRCan on this program has been recognized globally as a leading example of private-public partnerships on delivering results. But developing new markets and products is not a short-term exercise. It takes years, product familiarity, code, standards, market acceptance, and that's why this partnership must continue. The point is we have a real opportunity to grow these programs and this opportunity. And lastly, and equally critically, we need to continue to grow our relationship with Indigenous nations. As true partners in Canada's forest sector, BC became the first jurisdiction, as you know, to adopt and begin to implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And as Canada looks to implement its own legislation, ensuring that First Nations and Indigenous peoples have the decision-making frameworks, capacity, and the resources they need to participate in our sector will be key. In closing...
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in. We're about half a minute over, and I do want to get to the next ones. So if you want to do your quick conclusion, and that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. In closing, thank you. I just want to leave you with the thought that amidst a lot of global uncertainty, BC and Canada's forest industry has the people, the products, and the know-how to make a difference. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll move next to the Quebec Forest Industry Council with Monsieur Samray. And if I have mispronounced anybody's names in my introductions, please correct me when you take over the microphone. So, Monsieur Samray, you have 5 minutes.
In order to accelerate a little bit. So
the Quebec Forest Industry Council represents interests of Quebec softwood and hardwood sawmills, veneer mills, pulp, paper, cardboard, and panel manufacturers and engineered wood producers. And I'm here in Rimouski in a sawmill, a magnificent example of a company that wanted to use wood in its structures, and it shows that federal government could do this too. Clients love these new materials, and this is a great way to lower greenhouse gases. Now, this use of wood is important for the economy. In Quebec, the Quebec forestry industry provides huge number of jobs, some 2,000 employment to some 230,000 Canadians in 600 communities, and 12,000 are First Nations workers, and generates nearly 80 million in revenue annually and some 140,000 jobs. When it comes to climate change and the economic aspect, the forest is also a powerful tool in the fight against climate change. It acts as a giant reservoir to capture CO2. The forest allows us to fight against global warming. It's necessary to maximize sustainable use and management of our forest to improve its carbon capture and sequestration role by intensifying forest management, but also by promoting the use of wood in the substitution of carbon-intensive products in the construction sector, just as this example here today. And this in order to store carbon in the long term. And this is fully in line with the solutions proposed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the Government of Canada must lead by example by promoting and requiring less carbon-intensive products in its own tenders. Each ton of cement or steel substituted by wood significantly reduces a project's carbon footprint. And the Quebec Council has developed a tool to measure the carbon footprint of a building. The Government of Canada should work with us. It's a tool that will measure the carbon footprint, and the government should work with us to systematically use the tool for renovation and for new construction products, and this to measure the impacts of funds provided by government. The importance of investing in research and development partnerships to develop new wood-based materials and to include more of these materials in construction in Canada has a double benefit. Firstly, the economic development of Canada, since the raw material is wood and is harvested locally. And then, of course, the wood-based materials contribute significantly to the reduction of GHGs in construction. And finally, one of the Department of Natural Resources funding tools for our sector is the investment in forest industry transformation. And this is a very useful program. It's underfunded, especially when compared to the amounts invested in other sectors, notably for decarbonization projects. Transformation projects in our sector are expensive and they require government support. And we need only to think of the project to transform newsprint mills, which are still in decline. In conclusion, forestry in Quebec is done in a responsible and sustainable manner, just like as it's done in the rest of Canada. The industry is trying to improve things every day to be able to bequeath a forest for the future. And we want, of course, that the forest sector is ready to contribute to Canada's economic recovery and to the ambitious environmental goals that we have set for ourselves. And we are here to do that with you. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Great. Thank you for your opening comments. We're going to go next to Ms. McDonald with the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. So when you're ready, please begin.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Thank you for inviting me and my colleague, Jeff Colleen, to appear today on behalf of Canada's mineral exploration and development industry. First, I acknowledge that I come to you today from Toronto on the traditional lands of the Huron, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Oneida peoples, the Anishinaabeg, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and all of the Indigenous nations that have lived on these lands over the centuries. PDAC is the leading voice of the mineral exploration and development industry with over 6,000 members in Canada and around the world, including nearly 1,000 corporate members. Our work focuses on supporting a competitive, responsible, and sustainable mineral industry. We host the world's premier mineral industry event each year, attracting tens of thousands of people from more than 100 countries to Toronto for the PDAC convention in March. Notably, Canada's mineral industry consists of more than 1,100 public companies, representing a full 1/3 of all listings on Canadian exchanges. It is also the largest private sector industrial employer of Indigenous people in Canada on a proportional basis, and a key partner of Indigenous businesses across the country. Mineral exploration and mining is a major economic driver, supporting 664,000 direct and indirect jobs, contributing $132 billion to Canada's GDP last year. The economic opportunities presented by the mineral industry are heavily weighted towards northern and remote regions of Canada, and a job in exploration or mining will typically offer a salary nearly 3 times the national average. As the world looks for new sources of critical mineral inputs, Canada's vast potential for new discoveries represents one of the greatest economic opportunities in a generation and a fundamental component of meeting our own domestic needs over the coming decades. We know demand for critical minerals will increase substantially as jurisdictions around the globe attempt to transition to lower carbon footprints, and there is no energy transition without minerals. Canada can be the supplier of choice, both domestically and for our strategic partners. But to capitalize on this opportunity, we must attract investment in mineral exploration and downstream processing so that our minerals and metals can reach markets within realistic timeframes. We understand to drive such meaningful change, we must align government policies to strengthen our minerals sector and curtail our reliance on foreign sources that often leverage lower environmental, sustainability, and governance standards to compete economically. It is imperative that support is directed towards mineral supply chains in a logical and rational order so that we build up our natural resource wealth in step with downstream capacity. Otherwise, we risk creating a major supply chain imbalance as domestic demand could spike well in advance of any foreseeable ability to meet those demands from Canadian mineral sources. Mineral exploration and mining will increasingly be looking to Canada's north for new opportunities, and our critical mineral strategy hinges on industry having access to prospective land. So it is extremely important we consider the northern infrastructure deficit and our critical minerals strategy in working towards conserving 30% of Canada's lands and oceans by 2030 and achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. To achieve such long-term goals in a sustainable way, we must base land management decisions on evidence such as public geoscience and maintain a competitive landscape to attract investment into Canadian projects. Budget 2022 is a great first step by the federal government in dedicating new funding and incentives. However, reaching net zero will require additional financial and fiscal tools considering the sheer scale of electrification and infrastructure development involved in reaching this goal. We must also be mindful of the level of funding the U.S. and other nations are willing to commit to secure access to these necessary resources for future generations. Under this backdrop, we have offered recommendations for Budget 2023 that include increasing the Mineral Exploration Tax Credit, METC, from 15% to 30% in the territories and renewing it until 2027 in alignment with the new Critical Mineral Exploration Tax Credit. Expand the eligibility of Canadian development expenses for critical mine development from 30% to 100% to match eligibility under the current Canadian exploration expenses. Establish a one-window approach to available funding for early engagement and community capacity building to support Indigenous participation in critical mineral projects, provide co-funding opportunities to regional geoscience organizations to develop comprehensive regional level mineral and energy potential models to use in land management and conservation. Thank you again for your time, and we welcome any questions.
Great. Thank you for your opening statements. Now we'll move into the room here. And Mr. Nyber, we'll start with you. When you're ready, you'll have 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, and to Lisa and Jeff for enduring all the forestry people today. Nice to see you both. Canada's forest product sector, as the national voice of the sector, we welcome the discussion. It's a timely one for a few reasons. Number one, as Lisa said, as the government prepares to make decisions for federal budget 2023, it's important we're working in partnership to set our sector and its people up for success in the long term. Secondly, as we push through these challenging times, we absolutely need greater regulatory and policy certainty. There's a lot and a very heavy agenda at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and an agenda that our sector is very much aligned with in terms of the objectives. But some of the execution is falling a bit flat for us in some spots. We'd really like to see ECCC better understand how our sector works. We need it to be more responsive to our concerns in the national and global context. For us, initiatives like the clean fuel regulation and the output-based pricing system, which we support, are actually creating some problems for us more rather than solutions, and are bringing some uncertainty to investment in the future in Canada. Thirdly, I think it's important, we're seeing a number of things south of the border that must be considered if we're to ensure forestry workers and broader Canadian manufacturing workers aren't left behind. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act requires a robust response. While there's some positive signals in the fall economic statement around tax credits and the Canada Growth Fund, many details are still unclear. The competitiveness risk that this poses to Canadian industry cannot be understated, and the speed at which the Americans moving cannot be underestimated. The U.S. Buy Clean agenda is another big factor. Just on September 15th, Biden administration made another America First move, prioritizing the purchase of low-carbon construction materials, covering 98% of materials purchased by the U.S. government. This has been announced not only to green federal infrastructure in the U.S., but also to boost U.S. manufacturing. We need a strong Made in Canada, Buy Clean, Build Clean plan in response. And while the softwood lumber dispute continues, and Linda spoke a bit to that, our sector is facing additional trade risk with U.S. customers and in some U.S. states based on American-rooted campaigns of misinformation in an effort to restrict forest products exports heading to the U.S. FPAC's federal budget submission outlines the areas where we believe sustained investment is required. We're focused on supporting winning programs. We're on programs that accelerate innovation, that strengthen prospects for Canadian workers, and that deliver return on investment for the federal government and Canadian taxpayers. We have seen proven success in core funding programs supporting FP innovations, which I'm sure Stefan will talk about, the leading export market development work by Canada Wood, the leading building codes and standards work that's done by our partners at the Canadian Wood Council. Key NRCan dollars that power the Indigenous Forestry Initiative, which I hope Bradley's going to speak to in a bit, and the investments in forest industry transformation are also highly regarded programs by our sector and are consistently, massively oversubscribed annually. A couple areas we'd like to see a bit of a different work path with the federal government. One is on accelerating sector decarbonization. NRCan is our home for forest policy and science, but over the past few years, billions of federal dollars that power industrial decarbonization have been more centralized over at ISED. And this has put us at a bit of a disadvantage as we're not among the heaviest emitters. We have already reduced GHG emissions at our mills by nearly 70% since the early 90s, so it's a case of what got us here is not going to get us there. Over at ISED, we're being overshadowed by other sectors with bigger decarbonization needs. And the prevailing sense across government is that NRCan is our home. Unfortunately, it's a home that doesn't fund the decarbonization support programs that we need. As I discussed with Minister Champagne on Friday and Minister Wilkinson a few weeks ago, we need a clearer decarbonization roadmap and action plan for forestry with the federal government so our opportunities are not overlooked. We need access to our fair share of federal decarbonization dollars, and we're just finding ourselves in a situation where we're being left out because we're not big enough emitters. Secondly, and final point I'll make is on promoting and defending Canadian forestry workers. We've seen an uptick in anti-Canadian forestry activism in the U.S., and it's impacting our relationships with U.S.-based customers. We're also seeing state legislators in California and New York advancing anti-Canadian procurement bills to restrict Canadian forest products from going into those states. We're grateful from the support of the federal government, our provincial governments, but we continue to be in reactive mode, and we need a proactive Team Canada approach to address these issues. And for states like New York that seem immovable in their efforts, we need the federal government to send a strong signal back that such a move would have consequences to Canada and New York trade. I'll leave it there. I look forward to responding to any questions. And again, Mr. Chair, appreciate the opportunity.
Great, thank you. We'll now move to FP Innovations with Monsieur Renaud, and the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. My presentation will be English, but first a quick word in French. Je vous remercie.
Thank you for the opportunity to share our comments in the context of your study. I'm proud to be in the company of my colleagues.
Letting us in your room today to talk about forestry and where we are. It's great to be with the leading voice of forestry, NAFA, COFI, FPAC, all the players around us, and don't forget QFIC, of course. We all share this passion for the forest industry, and we all share this vision that the forest industry can have a bigger role to play in the carbon equation forward. So the world is changing fast, folks. Global warming, geopolitics of energy, technology will change drastically the landscape of natural resource going forward. We must prepare now. The industry needs to transform to be ready for that world. We need to be in a place where every molecule from the tree needs to be put at good use, need to be put towards keeping the carbon into the economy as long as it can. Innovation effort will be critical to achieve this goal. You know, according to the 2021 Global Innovation Index, Canada actually excels in research. Patents, papers, all those metrics, there's one place where we fall short. Transfer it to commercial product. This is where we're lagging versus the rest of the world. This is where we need to put the effort. That's the critical gap that needs fixing, crossing what we call the technology valley of death. This is where we want to play. This is where FP Innovation is playing. We're focused on impact on mills, demonstration at pilot scale, and result in the marketplace. You know, our R&D laboratory now employ about 400 people across Canada. We have lab in Quebec City, in Montreal, in Vancouver. We actually have programs in every province and territory to date. Some smaller, some bigger, but we're a bit everywhere. We have a unique model. We are right between government and industry, right in the happy place. We're trying to please both at the same time, which is interesting, believe me. Our ambition is basically to get the maximum value we can out of wood. Two fundamental things we need to do. Expand the wood usage. We all talk about it. Making sure wood have its best place in construction everywhere. That's number one. Number two, all the residue from the industry of traditional wood need to be used to their best usage to keep the carbon in the loop as much as we can. The challenges are enormous. We have a big role as the forest industry. Reduction of GHG, yes, but also substitution. Substitute oil product. Sequestered carbon into wood construction and other product. That's where we can play. Let me give you a couple of examples. Today, we have several demonstrations across Canada where we pave road with asphalt that have lignin in it. That's a byproduct of the pulp and paper mills. 10% substitution. Today, we have this mass that we created based on the challenge we got. Fully recyclable, compostable, based on natural fiber. That will be a product in a few months on the shelves. Truck platooning, we talked about before this session about the challenge of truckers up north everywhere. Well, we can do a train of trucks where only one driver is at the front, and that helped basically reduce this challenge that will affect 300 communities across Canada. With collaboration with the Wood Canadian Council, we're working a lot of standards, regulation, guides to help the construction industry to use more wood at every location. You know, moving forward now, we're looking with the Canadian Forest Service at Natural Resource Canada to create the next generation of program for innovation. Three main aspects. First, common good. All the regulation work, wildfire research, carbon evaluation in process and products, everything we can do to give that strong basis. Second, create a pipeline for innovation. All those programs, all those ideas we take from academia, from the world of creation of knowledge, and figure out how we transfer them to commercial product. Reduce risk to get there. Third, my cherished one, pre-commercialization. get those ideas towards closer commercialization, which involve actually collaborating with others. Oil industry, yes. Chemical industry, yes. Every place where we can basically have new product, use the fiber, the wood product to create new chemicals, to create new bioproducts, to create new place where we can have a longer carbon life. You know, Canada Renewable Forests are our natural resource. It has the potential to ensure a sustainable future. Innovation is how we transform the industry. We got to work together across government and industry every day, get the path forward. We can change the world this way. We have to grab the opportunity. Significant challenge to get all the programs in the right place. They need your leadership, your support to create the path for innovation. I believe we're going to get there. Thank you all for your support. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you for your comments. And I'll say that I recently had the chance to spend an afternoon at the Vancouver facility and saw some amazing innovations there. I was sent back with some samples, so I might even bring some in for show and tell here at some point. Yeah, it was a very worthwhile afternoon. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Young with the National Aboriginal Forestry Association. Mr. Young, when you're ready, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members, colleagues. I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to contribute to the study underway. My name is Bradley Young, and I am the Executive Director of the National Aboriginal Forestry Association. I'm also a citizen of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation in northern Manitoulin. I'd also like to take this time to recognize the traditional territory of the Algonquin First Nations, Kichisipi-Uski, otherwise referred to as Ottawa. First, a little background on NAFA. We are a non-governmental First Nations-controlled organization focused on Indigenous forest stewardship and associated economic development. Over 1,200 Indigenous forest sector businesses and over 15,000 plus full-time employees comprise the Indigenous forest sector. Maybe it's 30,000 now. In Canada, 80% of First Nations communities call the forest home. This is where the Indigenous forest sector comes from, and NAFA works hard to support it. Now to the business at hand. The Indigenous forest sector is supported by ISK-CERNA economic development programs. However, these economic development funds are spread over 633 plus First Nations and their myriad of business entities. Indigenous forestry projects must compete for space in the program with all other sectors of economic activity. The other major support is Natural Resource Canada's Indigenous Forestry Initiative. We suggest modernization of both of these budget line items with sector-specific fairness as a principle. ISK-CERNA economic development budgets should be increased by a minimum of 15% to address the historic underfunding of economic development. The Indigenous Forestry Initiative should be renewed at $12 million per year at a minimum for 5 years from the current $6.6 million per year for 3 years. Both of these programs suffer from substantial underfunding and oversubscription from our perspective. We have followed some of the committee's work on these matters. We remind Parliament that the Indigenous forest-based communities suffer from unemployment numbers ranging from 50 to 90%. The employment, capital attraction, manufacturing, and tax-based maintenance that the Indigenous forest sector anchors are absolutely vital for rural northern regions they operate in. We also note that many funding envelopes across many other departments contribute to Indigenous natural resource development initiatives in part. We suggest these programs continue to be supported, but to not forget about the Indigenous forest sector, including it as a discrete silo in their eligible sector program project criteria. We also take note of the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., including the $20 billion over a number of years for American tribal, renewable, green, climate change transition projects. This should be studied carefully. Relative supports and time horizons for Canadian Indigenous nations, including the bioeconomy, should be considered. The Indigenous forest sector has something to add to each of these. Sectorally, many forest management firms and smaller manufacturing mills are family-run small-medium enterprises. They are graying and rusting and need fresh capital and energy to operate into the future. Most of their kids and grandkids don't want the businesses. NAFA is advising that a national major Indigenous forest sector projects envelope, to convert these gray, rusty enterprises into green operations owned and operated by Indigenous groups and entrepreneurs be established. BDC, EDC, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and related provincial structures for the necessary major capital and finance support resources, along with other Indigenous ECDEV programs and funds for project feasibilities and development, should be oriented or reoriented around this pressing structural problem in Canada's forest sector. Importantly, all working forest businesses, including manufacturing facility projects, should be eligible. With foreign-owned interests, some friendly, some not, circling our natural resources, there's good security rationale behind this suggestion as well. With 10% of Canada's fibre basket under Indigenous commercial management now, manufacturers and forest sector businesses continue to emerge and grow. Supporting Indigenous trade missions to take advantage of our progressive trade agreements, such as IPECTA, APEC, CETA, CUSMA, and others under negotiation will also be vital. Can we start thinking about an Indo-Pacific Indigenous forestry trade mission? How about Africa? Non-Indigenous industry and Indigenous groups in these economic blocs have requested Canadian Indigenous forest sector trade missions in the past 5 years. As of yet, they have largely been unanswered. Miigwech, hai nanaskomtin munyazak, Ugamakanak, Egwanek, Gagano, Nawagu, Magantik, Anishinabek, Neheyoiak, and Ninanuak. Thank you very much, non-Indigenous leaders, and also thank you to all my colleagues and all my Indigenous relations.
Thank you so much for your opening comments. We're now going to go into our first round of questions, which are 6 minutes each. We'll have 4 of those. And so everybody knows we were a few minutes late starting. We do have, we'll check in at 5:30 and see where everybody's at and where we're at with our questioning. And we may be able to go a little bit beyond, but we'll check in at 5:30. So first up, I have Ms. Gladue for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to be at your committee today. You know, we're talking about how the federal government can better support various industries. So my question direction today will be about what governments do and what they don't do, what they fund and what they don't fund, and how that is impacting on you. I'm going to start with the British Columbia Council of Forest Industries. So in 2015, Chrystia Freeland said within weeks we would have a softwood lumber contract. And that never happened. And then we had the CUSMA negotiations, and again, still no deal. And then we've seen multiple tariffs from the U.S. and basically protectionism happening. So how has all of this lack of action on the part of the government impacted your industry?
Well, obviously the softwood, can you hear me okay? Sorry, I'm having some problems with my camera,
Yeah,
I think.
You're good. Yeah, your sound is
Apologies, but you can hear me. Okay. So as you know, this is almost an intergenerational dispute that's been going on. And as I said in my remarks, the federal government does play a key role in anchoring the relationship with the U.S. and in developing consensus on the Canadian side on how to approach things. Our understanding right now is that the opportunity for a negotiation with the U.S., another negotiation that might lead to a settlement, isn't on the table in 2022, 2023, but there will be opportunities moving forward. So it is something that our industry is working very closely with the federal government on,
Sure.
and we do rely on them.
Thank you so much. So 7 years, no action and no plan for next year. Let's go then to Forest Products Association of Canada. I want to talk about the Clean Fuels Standard. You mentioned regulatory certainty. What are the problems with the Clean Fuels Standard that are impacting your industry?
Thanks. So two main things. One is around the treatment or how Canadian biomass is viewed, or what we would call what would otherwise be wood waste from our sawmills. So the tree is harvested after the plan happens and the consultation goes to the mill, wood is created, and then you get shavings, bark, and sawdust. The treatment of that biomass under the Clean Fuel Reg is not yet recognized. That's one of our big issues. And we need certainty there. And there was talk at the officials level of setting up a new regime to determine if it's sustainable or not. Well, it's sourced from public provincially managed forests where there is detailed consultation, science, millions of dollars of planning goes in, and there's an approval process. So our position is if it comes from a provincially approved forest management plan, it should be recognized as sustainable. That would be that's the first frustration we have right now, and we're continuing to work through that with officials. The second one is around what qualifies for credit generation under the regulation, and that's still to be determined. But we've got some big companies that have opportunities to invest in other countries that want to see what that plan is. So I'd say those are the two big issues: the issue of the treatment and the recognition of the sustainability of biomass from Canadian well-managed Canadian forests, and how is this credit generation? How can we get some certainty around how the credit generation framework is going to unfold?
Yeah, I think uncertainty is driving a lot of projects to not be built and investors to not invest. My next question then is for PDAC. You talked about us needing to have a competitive regulatory environment for approving new projects and making Canada attractive to investors. Could you elaborate on what you think the federal government should do or not do to move in the right direction?
Yes, thank you very much for that question, and I'll handle the answer if that's okay, Lisa. When we think about what we need to do in Canada, as Lisa mentioned in her opening remarks, I think Budget 2022 was a good first step. We saw new incentives being committed to. We saw new funding being directed or notionally being directed towards infrastructure. So those are two pieces we definitely think need to be a continual focus. We're quite aware of the infrastructure deficit, as mentioned in the opening remarks as well, in Canada's north, and that's by and large where we're going to see our members moving into the future, more exploration into northern parts of Canada, because that's where the opportunities do lie. So we do feel that tax incentives are one way to fuel a competitive landscape here in Canada. We have seen the flow-through share regime, which ties to these tax credits, being highly successful. I think last year alone, we saw over $1.5 billion raised through flow-through share issuances that directly leads to exploration going into the ground in Canada within 18 months of that. So we're seeing that effect this year. There's somewhere in and around $4.3 billion being spent in Canada alone on mineral exploration in this year, and that's a number provided by Natural Resources Canada. When we look within that number, though, there's only about $200 million being spent on what
Excuse me, I'm coming to the end of my time. If I could have all the members, if you have input on what we should do on tax credits, could you submit it to the committee chair? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
45 seconds if you want. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Well, then I shouldn't have cut you off. My phone is probably not timing right. Let's talk about market diversification. With the rise in protectionism in the U.S., we really need to find other partners. So I'd like to hear from Forest Products Association and the National Aboriginal Forestry Association. How can we diversify?
Well, there's been a number of trade deals that we have negotiated. There are existing trade missions and various provincial initiatives that the federal government also supports through CFS. From the Indigenous forestry perspective, the Indigenous forest sector hasn't been included into those missions as fully as they could be. There are Indigenous products, Indigenous technologies, Indigenous businesses that the world is interested in, and we'd be happy to join and help along with Team Canada under a specific structure, and we'll say that.
All right.
And sorry, we're out of time on that
Sorry,
one now,
Jack.
so we will have to move on to get to our next person, but there may be a chance for others to come back to this or you to weigh in when you get to the other questions. Next, we have Mr. Shahal for his 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for witnesses for their testimony today. I'm going to start off my questioning with Ms. Cody. As you mentioned and discussed through your presentation, the net zero building strategy and the important role of forestry contributing to lowering greenhouse gas emissions in buildings. Can you tell us how and in which ways the forestry sector is driving down emissions in buildings?
Well, one of the ways is through products that capture and store emissions on a life cycle basis or on a basis that can extend into a couple of decades. So a common example in British Columbia of this would be, and the province has taken a lead in developing our mass timber sector as an example of a product that is that can help with the construction of affordable buildings and taller buildings made from wood, but also with carbon reduction.
And I want to pose the same question to Mr. Samre, who talked about the building you're in, but also talked about the measurement of the carbon footprints in buildings. Can you also tell us how the forestry sector is driving down emissions in buildings?
Yes, my pleasure. Wood is a carbon negative, as a negative carbon footprint. And when you use wood, 1 cubic meter of wood into a building, instead of using 1 ton of steel or 1 ton of concrete, you reduce your GHG content in the building by 1 ton. And this is all done through calculation that uses external and formal database that take into account the entire life cycle analysis of getting that tree from the forest into the building. So everything, wherever there is GHG compared to the business as usual situation is figured in. And in Quebec, there has been a strategy of using wood into governmental buildings. And for these buildings, we are accounting the number of GHG that has been removed. So there are some schools that have been built, and now they have a plate in front, kind of then using wood compared to a business as usual building, reduced by X number of tons the GHG into the building. So that's a way that wood can reduce substantially the amount of GHG into the buildings that belongs to government.
To Mr. Nybor, you talked about accelerating decarbonization in the sector. You also talked about the USA and the Inflation Reduction Act. Could you provide some specifics on where we in Canada can provide better incentives to help make that happen? And if you have very specific examples compared to the US?
Yeah, on decarbonization, I think there's a number of us. If you look at annual emissions in 2020, iron, steel, and aluminum were at over 20 megatons. Agriculture, chemicals, fertilizer over 18 megatons. Cement almost 11 megatons. Pulp, paper, and wood about 6 megatons. So the issue we're finding, and I think I said rightfully, is trying to get bang for buck. Where can we get a megaton at a time? Where can we get 2 megatons at a time? I get that. But I think we also got to pay attention to the smaller players. And with us, the average pulp mill, you might find 100,000 tons or 200,000 tons max. For us to get to a megaton, we'd have to stack a number of mills. So it's just that kind of middle way. And I encouraged Minister Champagne on Friday, and he was open to looking at it. And I just think there's been such a focus on big, heavy emitter decarbonization. I get it. But if we don't pay attention to the middle track, and we don't have a bit of a third way here for some of these other players like those in forestry, we're going to get left behind. On the U.S. piece, I think the clean tech tax credit in the FES is a positive signal. I can't wait to see what the Canada Growth Fund is going to look like. There could be opportunity there. But I know for our sector on decarbonization is that how can we decarbonize lime kilns? How can we do some of this project stuff that's not going to be a megaton at a time? Because we've got companies ready to do it, but just the financial support from government, the ability to tap into those programs is just not there right now.
Is there a specific ask that you would have on an incentive tax credit that would be an ask from your organization?
Yeah, I like the clean tech tax credit that was announced in the fall economic statement. I think that holds promise, but I think we need capital funding projects to decarbonize lime kilns. We've got a number of mills. We've got a couple of mills in northern New Brunswick, one in northern Manitoba. They don't have natural gas. Like they can't even dream about, like they're using heavier oil because that's all they've got. What are the solutions for those remote communities, many of which have a lot of Indigenous workers as well? So I think the funding piece, tax credits, very, very important, but I'd like to see some more mid-cap range funding opportunities for sectors like ours that aren't in the 10 to 20 megatons of overall emissions across the country annually.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will now go to Mr. Simard, who will have his 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. Very quickly, Mr. Samray, I would like to hear you on federal government supports for experts in the forestry sector, especially in the context of the softwood lumber dispute. I read recently that Resolute had some $500 million in countervailing measures. I'm not sure if this is a secret, but it seems like a considerable amount of money. And I recall we had a study in 2020 on the renewal of the forestry sector, and it was urgent to conclude an agreement with the United States, and especially to be able to access liquidity. Of course, nothing's been done on that yet, but I'd like to hear from you on this. I think that the industry is seeking a negotiated agreement, one that is viable and one that is good on the long term. Nobody wants to sign an agreement that is going to put them in a worse position. And I can understand that a lot of, members, have deposits and many millions of dollars, and companies would like to see this money to be able to invest it, but then the government, of course, would like to be able to tax it because those will be taxable amounts and help us finance our social programs. Now, of the programs, the Trade Department is always going to measure, quantify what is given to industry. In some of the U.S. coalitions, stating that the commercial programs offered by BDC or EDC was, in fact, a subsidy. And the response to that was no, not a subsidy, because the companies are paying. They're getting this from federal organizations, but it's not free money. They need letters to get these credits. And they are, it's not a subsidy. And the coalition has been told this. Now, if you hear people state that it is free subsidy money, it is entirely wrong because the companies are paying for those amounts. Do you think that at this time the federal government financial support is sufficient to transform the pulp and paper sector, which is very much needed because you know that that's shrinking? And I heard you mention ITIF. Now, do you think there is sufficient federal government support? I think that every cubic meter that is transformed, and I don't know the figures for Canada, but in Quebec, we have 220 of benefit. So, of course, there's, 1/3 goes to federal government and 2/3 to the provincial governments. The more industry can develop projects that can respond to the substitution of plastics or the new green chemistry, as Mr. Nyberg talked about, that is essential. And of course, there's not yet any regulation that imposes content regulation. So there's uncertainty, as Mr. Nyberg said. Now, the ITIF program, if it wanted to play in the same leagues as in the Scandinavian countries or the United States. It's not 20 or 50 million you'd need, but rather 2 or 3 billion to support the conversions. And thank you. Mr. Renaud, I've visited all of Quebec in the last few years to see what is being done in fiber. I've had discussions with people from the Quebec, and I'm always amazed at the potential in the forestry sector, but I'm told that nothing ever happens. I heard you mention the need to have, bolder approaches. Now, how can the government help you? Two things. Mainly, it's the evolution of fundamental research, because there's many wonderful ideas, and those need sustainable financial support. I'll give you a specific example. When you talk about subsidies or help for research, we're talking about short-term countries, 1, 2, 3 years. You have to set up partnerships with big industry, the chemicals industry. That requires long-term projects. So you can't be in constant renewal of a project. And if there is an initiative, you need to get involved. Several provinces and the federal take, 6 months to a year to put the program together, and then another couple of years. I've heard what goes on in Scandinavian countries, and it's a huge difference. The financing structure for transformation on the long term is guaranteed.
Now, Mr. Angus, we'll go to you for your 6 minutes.
Well, thank you for everyone. This is a fascinating discussion, and I think I'm going to be calling a few of you. If I don't get to ask you questions, we are going to be talking, because some of these issues really need a deeper dive. Mr. Young, I'd like to start with you. In a previous life, I worked for the Algonquin Nation, and the only time we ever got to meet the forestry companies was when we ran blockades. That was the way it was in the early 2000s, and things have changed dramatically since then. But it's still not a fair ground. We have communities where to assess long-term cutting plans, to be out there on the trap lines making sure everything's okay, then to have to deal with mining companies, and then to deal with hydro projects. It tends to be the same department on the reserve that doesn't have the kind of backup and support that a major company would have. Plus, they also then have to deal with, are they going to get beyond subcontracting and actually be able to get out there and take control and do something, and also do economic development. So I'd like to hear your thoughts, what you said about it's not the issue even so much of capacity, but the financing to be able to actually protect the forest and put an indigenous lens on development.
Well, I guess what you would want to do, what every nation that I'm aware of wants to do, is to have a comprehensive base of indigenous knowledge in a modern day format with proper mapping, GIS layers that's dynamic, that can model vegetative cover and different types of operations, industrial, traditional, you name it. Now, that knowledge layer takes money, and this is why in my submission I asked for an across-the-board increase to ISC, CERNA's economic development funding envelopes, because they have land planning capacity monies in there. Is 15% enough? Might there need to be some line item increases to the land use initiatives that they have underway? Probably. I think the latest numbers I was aware of was around 9 million they had for that for the whole nation. If you did some math on the 600 nations, let's say 400 of them need work, you're coming up with $30,000, $40,000 to fund very technical work. What you're asking there is quite complex. I would say you'd probably need around $150,000 over a number of years for a nation to say, hey, we're ready to talk. We can talk to an FPAC member. We can talk to a PDAC exploration miner. We can talk to our own people about what's there. And so I think that's part of the knowledge equation. I guess the next part of it is for nations that look at these other economic activities, what I think a lot of folks are realizing is that many of them now want to be involved on the industry side of the equation, but they want equity and they want a measure of control and participation, and they don't have equity to buy into an existing firm or an existing operation. And so that's where this $20 billion that is hanging there for tribal initiatives in the South, what if there was $5 billion for indigenous forestry, equity, loan guarantees to buy into operations, to get the economy moving, to do it to the right way, according to indigenous nations. I think that's how I like to think about things. It's complex. I don't know if I've got to the root of your
Very helpful because, to get to the table, it is very complex. It's not, you need to be able to map it, and you need the resources to do that right. In the communities that I've always worked with, the number one plan, even ahead of economic development, is protecting the land. Yep. That's always first and foremost. So when I talk to communities in the Cree communities, the Ojibwe communities, the Algonquin communities, I'm hearing again and again about glyphosate. It's killing amphibians. It's killing insects. The moose are not coming back. It's in the blueberries over a year after the cutovers have happened. We've seen the Monsanto papers released, and there's really frightening documents. Bayer has paid out $10.9 billion over cancer claims. So from an Indigenous perspective, because we know we're hearing this again and again from Indigenous communities who are saying they're just not going to go along with this anymore, what would you say representing Indigenous forestry in terms of managing the forest with or without glyphosate?
I'd say the precautionary principle would probably be the number one principle that Indigenous nations on the land would move to. But I think some of the science that is coming out with regarding a more naturalistic and indigenous, frankly, an indigenous forest management lens on that land base, when you're talking about free-to-grow prescriptions, mechanical or herbicidal, I think the long-term data now is coming out. And some of the work that's been done by Dr. Simard at UBC has spoke to this, where there's a lot of wisdom in the indigenous, but also the highest levels of science now saying, a more naturalistic way to manage the land base is better. What the indigenous forest sector would say, and this is actually all over the world, I've been all over the world, Mr. Angus, on this. Indigenous peoples will say, we don't want to live in a park, but we don't want to live in a plantation. And I think the chemical treatments that you're talking about and that type of intensity, that's more towards the plantation style type of value system with your activity base there. They want to be in the middle. And what they will say is about half of the land base we will use for cultural, traditional, setting aside, giving nature some resilience, some capacity to grow, some capacity to just do its thing. But the other half we want to make a living with. But each nation, this is where the planning comes through, each nation will have specificity. They may want more protection, they may want less, but they all want to make a living, and they all want to be on that land base from time immemorial to 7 generations from now.
Great, thank you. That concludes our first round. Our next round takes about 25 minutes, and so we're going to start up with Mr. Patzer with 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Samray, just wondering if you could pick up on a theme that you had in one of your previous interventions. Would it be safe to say, and maybe you could just elaborate on the point you're making, but would it be safe to say that there is some confusion around what actually constitutes a subsidy?
Well, I mean, I think that the Canadian government is measuring all its action, and what would be a subsidy, it would be something that would support some costs that are directly paid to the industry. So, I mean, the department is taking into account yearly what is done, what is financed by a Canadian government, and what is financed by different provincial government. And there's also some review yearly, and there will be some hearings really soon. We'll start, and so we'll have a good discussion on what is a support and what is not. But some of the pretension of the U.S. Is saying that the green electricity is a support to the industry, while it is not. In fact, the way that electricity is generated in Quebec is called for tender, and then after that, all this electricity is put in a pool, and then it is sold to the different users. So some pretension that it's saying that Quebec government is subsidizing electricity to the industry is totally false. And Quebec is using the same type of programs to back up some capacity as the other states. So there's use discussion or what is a pretension of being a subsidy and what is in fact could be accounted for some.
Okay, thank you for that. Appreciate that. I'm just wondering to any of the witnesses who are here from the forestry side, if you guys have any comments maybe around that, as far as if because we heard there's some misinformation campaigns toward the industry. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on just maybe elaborate a little bit more what that misinformation is. Maybe if it's on whether you're subsidized or not, or what that might look like.
So I think there's two parts of that. I think on the subsidy side, I think it's, the Americans will try to call anything a subsidy. That's part of the exercise here. And I know they've even claimed one of our youth mentoring programs that gets some government funding is a subsidy. Like, this is what we're dealing with, right? So I think so that's one thing. On the misinformation campaign, I think there's a few streams here. I think on the misinformation campaign, and NRCan is well aware of this, we're seeing some trends in terms of U.S. funded groups. And we can assume the motivation. Is it protecting U.S. industry? I don't think any of us can prove that, but there's an uptick in action to stop sourcing or to stop accessing materials coming from Canada's boreal forest. And the two bits of language that we're seeing in the trend lines are stop sourcing in primary forests. Primary forests are defined as forests that have never been harvested before. We're a young country, we got a lot of them. But in the boreal, they burn in about 100-year cycles, right? And now let's talk about the loss of economic opportunity, critical infrastructure, community evacuation, and carbon impacts of those fires. So this whole issue of primary forests and don't harvest in primary forests is ridiculous, and the context of that needs to be figured out. The other one is Canada doesn't have a deforestation problem. There are deforestation stats around urban development, agricultural development, those kinds of things. Some forestry roads, but the majority in forestry, it's regenerating and renewing. So the deforestation piece doesn't work in Canada. So the new term is degradation, which is not globally defined. So you are degrading the forest. Well, what does that mean? So these terms around primary and degradation are a couple of the emotive, sensational terms that we're seeing in international campaigns against Canadian forestry to try to undermine it. And I do know that NRCan is working in a global circle to try to address those two terms, if you will.
Okay, is there anybody else? We've got about 30 seconds. Anybody else that wants to comment on that at all? Mr. Young, go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead. I would just add to what Derek was saying about the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act in terms of the billions of dollars, and it's all carrots in that act and industry incentives for net zero and clean electricity. There's just a massive, if you want to say subsidy, there's a massive subsidization beginning to happen there as well. So, it's this question of an equal playing field.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move to Ms. DeBrusen next for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up a little bit on the conversation that we'd had earlier about mass timber and green buildings. And sorry, I never know which screen to be looking at. If I could actually ask Ms. Cody maybe to start, when we're talking about the different ways to encourage green buildings and mass timber, there are a few different pieces that can come together. And if we're looking at the certainty and creating the right market for more mass timber, what would you be suggesting do we need? We've talked a bit about credits and tax credits. Are there regulatory pieces? Is it subsidies? Is it regulation? Is it tax credits? What should we be looking at?
Well, it's probably, sorry, I'm having trouble here. Okay. Sorry. Derek, could you take that? I'm just having trouble here.
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I think some of that's on us in industry too, in terms of working. I'm giving a speech in Toronto to about 400 architects and engineers on Thursday to talk about Forestry 101, right? Like and also the ability to scale up. I think we're seeing more mass timber capacity. There's now an Element 5 plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. We have Chancy-Chibougamau in northern Quebec. We've got a couple in the interior BC. So I think building that capacity is going to be key. I think the pandemic and the lumber price issue was a challenge there for a little bit, for sure. But I think education and awareness, and even informing like electricians, like how can you think at the front end of a building design about the mass timber opportunity, and how does that change all of the work electricians and whatnot throughout? Because it is new. So I think a bit of that awareness is on our part, but definitely on the government side, tax credits, awareness through the GC Wood campaign at NRCan, which is excellent, and continuing to promote the carbon benefits.
Is that something that you're saying is ongoing, that's going well, or is it something?
Yeah, it's gone very well, yeah.
Sorry, you can keep going.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to make sure I understood that.
I think it's a mix of things. I also think, you know what, the best thing that this government and all MPs can do for Canadian forestry and mass timber, talk more proudly about us. I'm always shocked when I'm talking to some MPs, and they want to talk about forestry in the context of 2 billion trees or conservation, and that's all really important. But Bradley, I thought, really eloquently talked about there's conserving and protecting, and there's managing. And if you look at the most recent State of Canada's Forest Report, if you look at the area that we're managing and renewing, 25 times that land base is getting hit by pests and fires every year. Like, we got a massive fire problem. Look at California what's going on there in terms of forest management. So,
sorry, I'm just jump in because I'm really focused on the green building piece, and I think we've kind of ventured a little bit about how can we support promoting more of mass timber and green buildings. I just wanted to bring you back there.
But I think that where I was going is you can't build green buildings unless you harvest trees sustainably. And I think we need to be talking about, and Canada's a leader. I'm an advisor to the UN Forum on Forests. The global people are coming to me, the Swedes and the Finns. We've got a lot to be proud of here, and I think the mass timber thing, and you'll know it adjacent to your riding, the George Brown College building, it's a great way to connect with urbanites who might not know a lot about the industry in terms of the mass timber potential.
Thank you.
And I would just, sorry, I can't get my camera to work, but I would just add to what Derek has said that, it's really critical here to build out this sector is building out the supply chain and attracting the investment into the supply chain. So I think at the BC end of it, the BC government has put together, a task force that is looking at ways to do that. And I'm sure there'd be lots of opportunities to collaborate at the federal level around this.
Sorry, I just need to jump in. I'm going to stop the clock for a second. The issue is because we're televised, and for the interpreters, we do need to have cameras working when we speak. So we'll hope, Ms. Cody, you can get yours reliably going before you jump in again. But just I wanted to clarify that point. So we'll back to you, Mr.
Is it working with the flashing, or is it
that's okay? Yeah. So when she had it for opening statement and there was a bit of glitching, that's okay. But yeah, anyway, we're good. We have that intervention on record, and you have a minute left.
Thank you. Peut-être, Monsieur Renaud.
Mr. Renaud, maybe you can help me. What can we do to better support green buildings, and especially when we talk about, forestry products? How can we do better? I'll answer in English.
What if you were always asking when we do a public building, why don't you build in wood? And check that first. Because the alternative will always be positive on a carbon perspective to build with wood first. So that question is asked in some location, but not everywhere. Can you build in wood? Why are we not building in wood? What is this public building not built in wood first? That's the first thing. The second, code standards. This sounds boring, right? But all the codes and standards are built thinking about steel and concrete, not wood. We need code and standard that are performance-based, not how do you build it, but how the performance is. We're going towards that. We're progressing, but that's the emphasis. Not pick the material, pick the performance.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to go to Monsieur Simard for a brief 2.5-minute question.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Quite frankly, it seems that I keep hearing the same answers when we did the study on the forestry sector. If we want to be realistic, well, I'll have a question for Mr. Renaud and Samre. There are budgetary consultations that will happen soon. What can the federal government do concretely to support the forestry industry? I recall that one of the recommendations we had was to make carbon footprint a criterion to get government support. And so I'm thinking of the short term. And in your opinion, what do you think the government can do in the short term?
Yeah, this is Christophe from IT Services. Do you have some comments?
Je te suivrai.
Pretty good, you? I understand you have some issues connecting to our test room.
Il y a quelqu'un qui...
It seems there's interference.
We're just seeing. I think the question was going to be to Monsieur Samre, and then Monsieur Renaud. I've stopped the clock here until we get it sorted. So, Monsieur Samre, if you'd like to start with your question.
Yes,
or the response.
with pleasure. With pleasure, Mr. President. Donc, Monsieur Simard, je crois.
Mr. Simard, I'd like to come back to the fact that there's transformation necessary for new materials. So the IFIT program needs to be a transformational program, and you need it not just in terms of ambition, but also the means for that ambition. So that is fundamental. And that's on one hand, and I agree with Mr. Renaud that you need a performance-based standard. You need a carbon footprint by volume, cubic meter, or whatever. That's fundamental. You're in a hearing room, look around you, there's wood everywhere, and look at the paper you're working with. I'm here in a building with mass timber, and it can be done, and people are proud. And so you need another policy is to lead by example. Thank you.
So, nos programmes d'innovation.
So for innovation programs, we need support. In a more profound way, we have to realize what investments are necessary. Mr. Samre talked about transforming a plant into, say, a craft plant. It's not, a 50 million. It's a, $500 to $1 million. So it needs certainty. It means, leading the way forward. So we come back always to the forest because of the supply need.
Great, thank you. And now we'll go to Mr. Angus for his 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll turn my comments to Ms. McDonald. I live in the town of Cobalt, so obviously critical minerals is a big issue for us. Just over the hill from my house, the first cobalt processing plant is going into operation. Just outside of Timmins, we now have 2 major nickel deposits discovered. And if the companies can negotiate fairly with Niskandaga, Bumtung, Webakwe, and Martin Falls, we will have the Ring of Fire in the west part of my region. So the critical minerals strategy will have a huge impact on our region. The question I want to ask you is the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, because when I talk to people in the mining sector, they're looking at what's happening in the United States. They're talking about making deals in the United States. Does Canada need to pick up its game in terms of addressing the Inflation Reduction Act, which we've heard from some of our other witnesses in the mining sector, to make sure that not only are we able to mine the critical minerals, but we're able to get the value-added manufacturing and development from them, as opposed to just shipping them out to other jurisdictions?
If I may, Mr. Angus, I'd like to take that question if I could, and thank you very much for that. To your question, are we doing enough? As we mentioned earlier, I think the most recent federal budget, 2022, was a good first step. We're seeing that new tax credit for critical minerals come to bear. That should be a way to usher in more investment in exploration in Canada. That should be a way for us to develop more of a resource base in critical minerals, whether that's rare earth, cobalt, lithium, graphite, those things that we will need into the future. But to your point about the Defense Production Act, about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, when we think of that critical minerals exploration tax credit commitment, it's an excellent one, but it constitutes about $400 million over 5 years of foregone revenue by the federal government. It's not an outlay of funds, if you will. And then you marry that, or you compare that, if you would, to the Defense Production Act, where the US government may look to invest as much as $500 million into one single project in Canada that's at the bankable stage to get that to a producing asset that may flow materials to the US. So when we think of those two scales, $400 million in a tax credit over 5 years in Canada versus up to maybe $500 million per project by the US government, we can do the simple math and suggest to us that yes, and more will need to be done here in Canada so that we can retain more value-added processing activities here and actually see that economic wealth retained here in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to go to Mr. Dreeshen, who has 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of our witnesses. Mr. Nyber, you had mentioned some of the discussions around our 2 billion trees initiatives and so on. I know there's an announcement today describing that. Of course, somehow it's lost in the narrative the reality of what provinces and foresters have been doing for decades. Because the industry in Alberta planted more than 100 million trees in 2021. Ontario, 36.7 million trees. BC plants, on average, 218 million trees a year. Industry is doing that, and they're doing their part, and it's a great photo op to be able to talk about these things. But the reality is, as you have indicated, that's just a very small part of what is important as far as the forestry industry is concerned. So my question is, are there other initiatives such as insect and disease condition control, old growth forest management, mountain pine beetle and so on, where the government could actually be doing some things that would be more effective?
Yeah, I'll start by saying I think the 2 billion tree program, and we do 400 to 600 million trees. It really depends on seedlings a year. So we provided some advice to NRCan up front because we know that business. We don't want to jam the nurseries. We don't want to have a short labor pool. There was just a lot of practical considerations. And I think it's also important to know in areas that are scorched by fire, where the trees aren't regenerating, it's up to the provincial governments if it's on provincial land to regenerate. So the 2 billion tree program is doing some good work there. I know a lot of work has been done in BC to kind of get at some of those lands, Kelowna, Penticton, that have been really scorched by fire.
But haven't these been being done for decades?
Well, sorry?
Have not these initiatives been being done for decades?
Not at this scale. I think BC's had to do more because of fires, but I do think so I don't want to blow by benefits of the 2 billion tree program.
Okay.
It's my first. But where I think the wildfire prevention, the Forest Enhancement Society of British Columbia is doing some great thinning and proactive efforts. Indigenous cultural burning is another huge opportunity. So let's get at the pests fast. But a big reason that we get at the pests fast because we have foresters on the ground that find the pests. So pest and fire risk mitigation, I would say.
Well, thank you very much. And I think going back to some of the discussion we had before about misinformation campaigns and deforestation or degradation, there's always going to be some group out there saying we want to protect our own industries in our own countries, and we're going to do all we possibly can to make it difficult for Canadians, and we have, instead of this standing proud approach, we have this we're sorry approach. We went after our oil and gas industry and pretty well have destroyed that. Agriculture, we go over. I'll take the discussions on GMOs and glyphosates that was discussed earlier. There are issues and concerns that we have there. Mining, I'm just trying to figure out how it is in the mining industry that we're going to be able to handle the negative press that we are going to be getting from around the world. And I'm glad that in Mr. Angus's riding that we'll be able to see the example of how that is done, because we know there's going to be a lot of pressure. And if we could get to the stage where the management of those sites would be as good as what we have in northern Alberta in the oil sands, that's what we need to do, is to make sure that all of the industries will be able to get to that level. But I'm just curious how, and for PDAC, and I was at the convention earlier in June, looking at what is required for EV batteries, 500,000 pounds dug up in order to get yourself a 1,000-pound battery. And then you have to get it. You then have to process it. You then have to deal with all of the chemicals associated with it. how are we going to get ahead of the environmental groups that are intent on demonizing everything that we have to do with natural resources?
If I could respond to that, Mr. Dresden, thanks for the question. I think to that concept of winning hearts and minds of Canadians, I very much welcome, and we would welcome as PDAC, any support from the federal government of just talking about the minerals industry. You mentioned mining, and for sure, mining is a part of this process, but the mineral industry is more than that. And, you know, to be a bit coy, I've used this phrase before. If we looked at oil and gas and called it the sucking and pumping industry, we would think of it very differently. So I think a part of the government's role is to help us bridge this gap with Canadians, help them to understand that minerals are an inherent part of everyday life, whether that's high technology or whether that's the cotton shirt that I'm wearing today. It came from a factory, it went on a train, it went on a truck, and I took a piece of public transit to a mall that's all built out of minerals to acquire it. So it's an essential part of life. We need to make sure that Canadians understand that inherently.
And I understand, Mr. Samray, that you need to jump off now. So when you need to go, just feel free to leave the meeting. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the rest of us will continue on. So we're going to go now to Mr. Sobera, who has 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome to all the witnesses. First, I'd like to speak to the individual at PDAC. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for the organization. I know all of us probably have already received the March 2023 email notification of the PDAC conference, which will happen again in Toronto. And I plan to be there. I know all my colleagues here will do likewise. In terms of your commentary on, you had a few recommendations, and you spoke about the eligibility of critical mining expenses, I believe, supply chaining capacity, and also access to prospective lands in order to undertake mining. Can you just elaborate on your comments there? Because I did find them quite insightful.
Certainly happy to, and thank you for that question. When we think of the challenge that's involved with mineral exploration, it's pretty extreme. From the concept of discovery through to production, only about 1 in 10,000 mineral showings actually meets the criteria of what would.
Mr. Killeen, you are now on mute.
Pardon me. Thank you. Apologies for that. So to your question, only about 1 in 10,000 mineral showings actually reaches production. So there's already an inherent impediment for a mineral explorer looking in Canada to bring a new project to market. So we understand that that is a huge hill to climb for mineral exploration in Canada. When we think of critical minerals, we understand just the nature of the geology. I'm a geologist by training. These deposits are likely to be smaller, more disparate or disaggregated. And so it will require, in many cases, more projects to make up that production base that was referred to earlier in terms of sourcing. So there are a few things that we need to focus on. We've talked about mineral tax credits, obviously, as one key part, but also thinking about the amount of land that we need to reasonably access in a reasonable amount of time to conduct the work to identify those deposits is super critical. We feel that there could be more efforts by the government placed on doing some of that baseline public geoscience work that can, develop that public good, be the evidence that we can start to make more land management decisions, be more proactive in identifying areas where mineral explorers can go. I think it was referred to by some of our forestry colleagues earlier that, integrating traditional knowledge and integrating cultural values into making land management decisions, that's something that our industry certainly endorses, but we have to make these decisions expressly. We have to figure out where we can go and explore.
Thank you for that information. I would like to just to switch to Derek, great to see you in the whole forest products industry. Having grown up in northern British Columbia, and how important the sector is to many communities along Highway 16, starting from Prince Rupert all the way to Prince George, and then down through the interior, and how many communities the forest product sector supports in British Columbia. In terms of, you made the reference in terms of GHG reductions, where the forest sector in itself is what I would consider a low emitting sector, and where bigger lemons are able to get squeezed in terms of GHG. In your partnership between ISED and ECCC, where would you make your recommendations where we can help continue to grow the sector It is renewable. Wood has always been renewable for a long time. I still remember growing up and seeing the tree plantations at different colors in northern British Columbia of trees. In terms of growing the sector and also reducing GHGs, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think we could learn a lot from Sweden and Finland, who are on more aggressive net zero roadmaps. Finland 2035, Sweden 2045, and they've taken a very full value chain, sector specific approach to bring policy, regulation, legislation, funding programs, tax incentives together. And in Canada, we haven't quite done it that way. And I'm not saying it's. I just wish it was a bit more coordinated, to be honest. But in that, I think the opportunity is twofold. There's the mitigation side. As I said, we still have some GHG reductions to take care of at our mills, and we need a better path with this government to do that. The other side is the adaptation agenda. The other side of the carbon story is much of it is beyond our control, because it is drought, pest, fire, and that's creating a massive carbon problem in this country. And the national adaptation strategy that's still under development is going to be an important tool that we can feed into as well.
My last comment would be, I know a number of the witnesses today mentioned or cited the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm completely on that page. We did the first large step in the FES in terms of responding to that. We are seeing companies make announcements in the United States with regards to, in response to the IRA, and that is serving as a catalyst. Here in Canada, we need to find our comparative advantage, which I know we have many of in many sectors, to continue growing, creating wealth and creating good jobs. I look forward to Budget 2023 as well, and we'll put my input and my thoughts on that, because it is very, very important that we respond to the IRA.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm just going to look to the committee. I had talked to people before we started about if we would end at our regular time of 5:30. We do have resources slightly beyond. A number of you did say that you needed to leave as close to 5:30 as possible. So if we're good with ending now, I think we'll do that. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists for being here, our witnesses today, for your expertise and the insightful comments that you've offered. Just give me 1 second, Mario. I'll come to you before I conclude. There are 2 quick items. I just wanted to let people members know that on Thursday, November 24th, we'll have our final panel of witnesses on this study. And I also wanted to find out the supplementary estimates were tabled in the House on Thursday past. And so I'm just wondering if the committee would like to invite officials or the minister or some combination thereof to come for SUPSB. I'm seeing some nods around the table. So we'll put out an invitation to the minister's office and see if he's available, and officials, and see what we can land before we have to report back to the House. Okay, so with that, Mr. Simard, I'll turn to you. You had a question.
Yes, I would like to take a few minutes, because we do have a few minutes left, to file a notice of motion which will facilitate our work. Maybe our dear clerk could distribute it. That pursuant to the Standing Order of 108.1a, an order of the committee be issued to require the Canada Energy Regulator to produce, no later than December 16, 2022, an unredacted copy of any notices, analysis, and recommendations of Canada Energy Regulator relating to the government's decision to acquire, expand, operate, and eventually divest of the Trans Mountain Pipeline System, and any other relevant documents. If no such analysis has been produced by the Canada Energy Regulator, that the Canada Energy Regulator provide the committee with a written confirmation. Thank you. I believe the clerk has this motion. I think that this could help us with the work, and this is part of the answer given to us by the Energy Regulator, which I believe was incomplete.
Well, I support my colleague. I was actually feeling that some of the questions we heard back from the Canadian Energy Regulator did not seem to me to jive with what probably had been negotiated, but I don't know, we have a lot of time, so I would just say it's a reasonable request. It's part of the information that a member can ask for, so I don't know if we even need it as official, but I think it's a reasonable request, so I support it.
Yeah, we'll take it as being put on notice, and so, yeah, thank you for that. And with that, seeing no other hands on that, folks, thanks for joining us today. Meeting's adjourned.